Book 3, Chapter 3 of the Lancashire Witches. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, A Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 3, Houghton Tower. Chapter 3, Middleton Hall. Middleton Hall, the residence of Sir Richard Assheton, was a large quadrangular structure, built entirely of timber, and painted externally in black and white chequer work, fanciful and varied in design, in the style peculiar to the better class of Tudor houses in South Lancashire and Cheshire. Surrounded by a deep moat, supplied by a neighbouring stream, and crossed by 4 drawbridges, each faced by a gateway, this vast pile of building was divided into 2 spacious courts, one of which contained the stables, barns, and offices, while the other was reserved for the family and the guests, by whom the hospitable mansion was almost constantly crowded. In the last mentioned part of the house was a great gallery, with deeply embayed windows, and filled with painted glass. A floor of polished oak, walls of the same dark lustrous material, hung with portraits of stiff beauties, some in ruff and farthingale, and some in a costume of an earlier period, among whom was Margaret Barton, who brought the manor of Middleton into the family. Frowning warriors, beginning with Sir Ralph Assheton, Knight Marshal of England in the reign of Edward the Fourth, and surnamed the Black of Assheton under Lyne, the founder of the house, and husband of Margaret Barton, before mentioned, and ending with Sir Richard Assheton, grandfather of the present owner of the mansion, and one of the heroes of Flodden. Grave lawyers, or graver divines, a likeness running through all, and showing they belonged to one line. A huge carved mantelpiece, massive tables of walnut or oak, and black, and shining as ebony, set round with high backed chairs. Here also, above stairs, there were long corridors, looking out through lattices upon the court, and communicating with the almost countless dormitories, while on the floor beneath, corresponding passages led to all the principal chambers, and terminated in the grand entrance hall, the roof of which, being open and intersected by enormous rafters and crooks of oak, like the ribs of some tall amiral, was thought from this circumstance, as well of its form, to resemble a ship turned upside down. The lower beams were elaborately carved, and ornamented with gilded bosses and sculptured images, sustaining shields emblazoned with the armorial bearings of the Asshetons. As many as 300 matchlocks, in good and serviceable condition, were ranged round the entrance hall, besides corselets, salmain rivets, steel caps, and other accoutrements. This stand of arms having been collected by Sir Richard's predecessor, during the military muster made in the county in 1574, when he had raised and equipped a troop of horse for Queen Elizabeth. Outside the mansion was a garden, charmingly laid out in parterres and walks, and not only carried to the edge of the moat, but continued beyond it, till it reached a high knoll, crowned with beech trees. A crest of tall twisted chimneys, a high roof with quaintly carved gables, surmounted by many gilt vanes, may serve to complete the picture of Middleton Hall. On a lovely summer evening, 2 young persons of opposite sexes were seated on a bench placed at the foot of one of the largest and most umbrageous of the beech trees crowning the pleasant eminence before mentioned, and though differing in aspect and character, the one being excessively fair, with tresses as light and fleecy as the clouds above them, and eyes as blue and tender as the skies, and the other distinguished by great manly beauty, though in a totally different style, still there was a sufficiently strong likeness between them to proclaim them brother and sister. Profound melancholy pervaded the countenance of the young man, whose handsome brow was clouded by care, while the girl, though sad, seemed so only from sympathy. They were conversing together in deep and earnest tones, showing how greatly they were interested, and as they proceeded, many an involuntary sigh was heaved by Richard Assheton, while a tear more than once dimmed the brightness of his sister's eyes, and her hand sought by its gentle pressure to reassure him. They were talking of Alizon, of her peculiar and distressing situation, and of the young man's hopeless love for her, She was the general theme of their discourse, for Richard's sole comfort was in pouring forth his griefs into his sister's willing ear. But new causes of anxiety had been given them by Nicholas, who had arrived that afternoon, bringing intelligence of James Device's capture, and of his threats against Mistress Nutter. The squire had only just departed, having succeeded in the twofold object of his visit, which was, firstly, to borrow £300 from his cousin, and secondly, to induce him to attend the meeting at Hoghton Tower. With the first request Richard willingly complied, and he assented, though with some reluctance, to the second, providing nothing of serious moment should occur in the interim. Nicholas tried to rally him on his despondency, endeavouring to convince him that all would come right in time, and that his misgivings were causeless; but his arguments were ineffectual, and he was soon compelled to desist. The squire would fain also have seen Alizon, but understanding she always remained secluded in her chamber till eventide, he did not press the point. Richard urged him to stay over the night, alleging the length of the ride and the speedy approach of evening as inducements to him to remain; but on this score the squire was resolute, and having carefully secured the large sum of money he had obtained beneath his doublet, he mounted his favourite steed, Robin, who seemed as fresh as if he had not achieved upwards of 30 miles that morning, and rode off. Richard watched him cross the drawbridge and take the road towards Rochdale, and after exchanging a farewell wave of the hand with him, returned to the hall and sought out his sister. Dorothy was easily persuaded to take a turn in the garden with her brother, and during their walk he confided to her all he had heard from Nicholas. Her alarm at Jem Device's threat was much greater than his own, and though she entertained a strong and unconquerable aversion to Mistress Nutter, and could not be brought to believe in the sincerity of her penitence, still, for Alizon's sake, she dreaded lest any harm should befall her, and more particularly desired to avoid the disgrace which would be inflicted by a public execution. Alizon, she was sure, would not survive such a catastrophe, and therefore at all risks it must be averted. Richard did not share to the same extent in her apprehensions, because he had been assured by Nicholas that Mistress Nutter would be removed to a place of perfect security, and because he was disposed, with the squire, to regard the prisoner's threats as mere ravings of impotent malice. Still he could not help feeling great uneasiness. Vague fears, too, beset him, which he found it in vain to shake off, but he did not communicate them to his sister, as he knew the terrifying effect they would have on her timid nature, and he therefore kept the mental anguish he endured to himself, hoping ere long it would diminish in intensity. But in this he was deceived, for instead of abating, his gloom and depression momently increased. Almost unconsciously, Richard and his sister had quitted the garden, proceeding with slow and melancholy steps to the beech crowned knoll. The seat they had chosen was a favourite one with Alizon, and she came thither on most evenings, either accompanied by Dorothy or alone. Here it was that Richard had more than once passionately besought her to become his bride, receiving on both occasions the same meek yet firm refusal. To Dorothy also, who pleaded her brother's cause with all that eloquence and fervour of which she was mistress, Alizon replied that her affections were fixed upon Richard, but that while her mother lived and needed her constant prayers, they must not be withheld, and that looking upon any earthly passion as a criminal interference with this paramount duty, she did not dare to indulge it. Dorothy represented to her that the sacrifice was greater than she was called upon to make, that her health was visibly declining, and that she might fall a victim to her over zeal; but Alizon was deaf to her remonstrances, as she had been to the entreaties of Richard. With hearts less burdened, the contemplation of the scene before them could not have failed to give delight to Richard and his sister, and even amid the adverse circumstances under which it was viewed, its beauty and tranquillity produced a soothing influence. Evening was gradually stealing on, and all the exquisite tints marking that delightful hour were spreading over the landscape. The sun was setting gorgeously, and a flood of radiance fell upon the old mansion beneath them, and upon the grey and venerable church situated on a hill adjoining it. The sounds were all in unison with the hour, and the lowing of cattle, the voices of the husbandmen returning